this guy speak some really fascinating ideas about how God's creation and the things that are grotesque in nature can actually be really, really beneficial. And I guess I should have probably titled this An Ocean Full of Endosymbionts rather than Parasites. And so I think the one thing that we can learn, many things we can learn from Dr. Ingalls' talks, but one thing is that parasitism is a lot more complicated than simply an animal that lives inside another animal or an animal that causes harm to its host. It actually takes quite a bit of research to figure out what this little tiny, often microscopic creature is doing inside its host. How did it get there? When did it get there? Is it harming its host in any significant way? Is it providing a benefit to its host in any significant way? So there's lots of complexity to the history of parasitism, and Dr. Ingle mentioned all these life cycles of parasites. Sometimes they have multiple hosts, sometimes they're microscopic, and we just kind of take that for granted nowadays. But it wasn't that long ago that we really had no idea how these parasites got to be where they were. And it took over 200 years of some of the best scientists in Europe working on this question to figure out where the source of parasites was. You can't go outside and find a tapeworm on the sidewalk, right? It's only ever found inside a human or an animal host. And so for basically all of human history, we assumed they were non-living things that the body just spontaneously generated. And then when microscopy was invented, we figured out, no, these are animals. They have reproductive organs, they have mouths, they reproduce and grow. So they're animals, but they're not found external in the environment anywhere. So they must still be spontaneously generated inside the host body. And so spontaneous generation was the best scientific evidence we had for where these parasites came from. And in 1850, this guy right here, Friedrich Kuchenmeister, he was a really fascinating individual. He's a German pastor, German physician, and he taught himself Hebrew, and he studied biblical zoology, and he was an amateur parasitologist. And he had an idea based on how he perceived the character of God that spontaneous generation was false. And so the leading scientists of the day, spontaneous generation is the best evidence we have. We have no evidence of any external environmental source. We can't see these little eggs. What we do see is these little, the arrows are there. This is a picture of some raw beef with some little nodules in it. These little nodules are the immature stages of tapeworms. There's a little bladder-filled sac, and they've got a little inverted hook in there. And once the definitive host, the human in this case, eats that undercooked meat, that's when the meat dissolves in your intestines, and then the larva, everts this proboscis and stabs it into your intestines, and then it starts growing. So the current theories, 1840s, 1850s, was that there was a single tapeworm species, and all of these other nodules that you see, these are strays. These are dead ends. So God specifically designed the tapeworms. Interestingly, Dr. Ingle kind of has this same idea, that tapeworms are so exquisitely designed. A lot of these endosymbionts are so perfectly designed to be where they are that the original creation had to include them in some way, maybe with a different function. But they had to be there. So the idea is that there's a single tapeworm that's supposed to live in human intestines. But when it wanders into cows or birds or pigs, it's not the right place to be. And so it forms these little, these dead-end larvae, and it doesn't mature anymore. So that was the current idea. The best parasitologists in the world established this. This had the whole weight of the scientific evidence in its favor. But Kuchenmeister rejected this scientific idea for theology. So he thought that God, being a perfect designer, would not create an organism, there'd be no accidents in nature. So it wouldn't be possible for an animal to wander into a host where it wasn't supposed to be. God placed every individual creature exactly where it was supposed to be, and it didn't change. So another thing that Dr. Ingle pointed out was that essentialism of species was an incorrect philosophy, but it had its origins in Christian theology. So Kuchenmeister said, I suspect that this is not spontaneous generation, that this is actually a life cycle where these little nodules are the immature forms of the adults. So what did he do? to test his idea. He didn't just have the idea, he tested it. And I think that's really important, that creation scientist, if we have an idea that goes counter to the current scientific consensus, we don't just stop at speculation, we test the idea. So I don't advocate for how he tested it, but I like that he did test it. So he took some of this undercooked beef and he made a soup out of it, and then he took it and fed that parasite soup to condemned prisoners at regular intervals before their execution, at 3 days, 7 days, 10 days, and 14 days. And then after the prisoners were executed, he exhumed the bodies and dissected them, and to his morbid delight, he found adult tapeworms. And so again, a little unnerving, deeply unethical, don't do that type of science. But I think it's important that you let your theology influence your scientific hypotheses. And this established this was the first definitive evidence, direct evidence of the life cycle of a beef tapeworm. This Kuchenmeister, even though he's an amateur parasitologist, he's not a professional. He is considered the founder of experimental helminthology, and a whole host of life cycles were discovered because of him, because he let his theological convictions inspire specific scientific hypotheses, and then he did the research. I think that's wonderful. And so what I'm going to talk about today is trying to mirror that philosophy. Again, not the type of scientific experiment specifically, but the idea of letting your theology influence your science. A lot of people, here's a quote by him, having all these stray worms, which was the consensus. He said that it contradicts the wisdom of the Creator and the laws of harmony and simplicity put into nature, and it's contrary to the wise arrangement of nature, which undertakes nothing without a purpose. So that was his theological motivation to do his science. And nowadays, when most scientists are trained, I was trained as a scientist professionally under this two spheres model of how your science and your faith interact. So this comes from a famous paleontologist, Stephen Jay Gould, who defines this term called non-overlapping magisteria. So he agrees that science and faith are both important, but they belong to separate domains. They have different influences, they ask different questions, and you shouldn't mix them. So he says that the net of science covers the empirical universe, what it is made of, and why does it work this way, and the net of religion covers things that has moral value. And you can't mix them. And Kuchenmeister was mixing them, and Gould would say that was inappropriate. We need to keep our science and our religion separate. I think this works for most of the time. For a lot of the scientific questions I ask, if I'm investigating my parasitoid flies and I want to know how many species there are in a meadow, or I'm investigating these cricket assassin wasps, and I want to know if they're generalist parasitoids or specialists, these scientific questions, I don't begin by reading Genesis, and I don't attribute my results to the activity of God necessarily. I think that would be an inappropriate merging of these two spheres. So a lot of experimental science, I think Gould is right. It does operate kind of independently of your theological convictions. At the same time, I should say that my motivations for doing the science is different than maybe an atheist. So even though a theist and an atheist might do the exact same science, the exact same experiment, my motivation for doing this is significantly different. But there are some questions that I can't help but they cross these boundaries between science and faith. I can't keep the science and the faith completely separate. And I think in every subdiscipline of science, there are these issues. So astronomy, you have to deal with questions about the beginning of the universe. This is implicit to your discipline, and yet this is a theological, philosophical question. In physics, you have to deal with the determinacy or indeterminacy of reality itself. This is a theological and scientific idea altogether. In neurobiology, is the immaterial soul something real that really affects the physical reality, or are brains just physical matter? This crosses the boundary between science and religion. If you're an ethicist or an animal behaviorist and you see animals doing things that appear to be moral, where does morality come from? Is morality something real? Again, theology and science mixed together. Geneticists have to answer questions about genealogy and Adam and Eve, and environmental ethicists and ecologists have to deal with the question of goodness in nature. So there are these things. So even if I think that there are kind of two spheres, science and religion, and most of the time we can operate these independently, and they don't interact very much, there are specific questions where they do. And in these specific questions, these are the interesting questions. I could talk about these forever. These are what make life interesting. They're unknown, difficult questions that are worth pursuing because they have importance both in science and philosophy. And in these, I think it's entirely appropriate that our theological convictions inspire and shape, not just motivate, but actually shape specific scientific hypotheses. And that's what I'm going to try to do here, specifically with regard of the origin of parasites after the fall. So I'm going to start with the distinct hypothesis. And this, again, goes back to Kuchenmeister and Dr. Engel and the exquisite design of parasites in nature. Their morphology, their behavior seems to be designed to be where they are. So one of the founders of parasitology was an Italian scientist named Antonio Vallisneri, a man of superb fashion sense. And this guy had a really brilliant idea. So he sees Ascaris lumbricoides, which I actually didn't know was mostly commensal in humans. I thought that was a true parasite. So that's really interesting to know. 1 billion people are infected with Ascaris lumbricoides, and Vallisneri thought these are harmful parasitic creatures that, and yet they're designed to be inside the human intestine. So he hypothesized that they had a different function before the fall. So he writes, it is not reasonable to suppose that God would have placed the first worm in Adam's body because man was to be free of all kinds of diseases. Instead, perhaps these parasites would, by gently licking the intestines and by healing them, do their host a kindly office. And after the fall, these worms were made the ministers of divine justice and raised an insurrection upon him. Look at when he's writing this, 1713. This is 300 years ago. The founder, one of the fathers of parasitology as a discipline, when they're just figuring out that parasites even exist as real creatures, they're wrestling with theological and scientific questions the same way we are today. 300 years later, famous young earth creationist parasitologist writes, it is difficult to reconcile this kind of existence with a benevolent creator who would declare this to be good. The organisms that now live as parasites must have been designed to fulfill a function that is either no longer operating or not operating in the same way it did before the fall. And a little while earlier, I said these guys are to belong to the despicable category of environmental aesthetics. So these are corrupted beauty. It's a relationship which has intrinsic beauty, but it's a corrupted, harmful relationship. So this is kind of where we're starting as a hypothesis. I think it's important to then model maybe how accurate this hypothesis might be. So our beginning idea is that all parasites have differentiated from non-parasitic ancestors in the last 10,000 years. And a few important things about models. So models don't prove anything. Scientific models don't establish truth, and they don't prove anything. So I'm going to, what models do is test plausibility. They ask how likely is the data given this hypothesis. So I'm not going to prove anything to you. I'm not going to prove that the earth is young. I'm not going to prove that parasites are the result of the fall. What I want to do is explore the likelihood that the young earth model can deal with the diversification problem. And by the diversification problem, Dr. Engel kind of mentioned this too, that we have a lot of parasite species. There are thousands upon thousands of species. And the bigger, the more numerous these post-fall organisms are, the more difficult it is for young earth creationists to explain how in the world they exist. So, for example, if you have a group of, the largest family of parasitoid wasps is the Ichneumonidae. And I think there's about 300,000 species of ichneumoniid wasps. So if I say that there were no parasitoids before the fall, I have to explain how 300,000 wasps became parasitic in 10,000 years. That's a big challenge. If there's only a single parasitoid wasp, and I said we have a single parasitoid wasp that differentiated from non-parasitic ancestors in 6,000 years, that's pretty simple. I can say that I don't even have to think of any unique genetic mechanisms or any reason. No natural selection can handle that. One species in 6,000 years, easy. 100,000 species in 6,000 years, unlikely. So what I'm wanting to investigate is how likely, if we look at not just one example, but a whole host of examples of lineages of parasites, how speciose are these lineages? How many species have to come from a Brahmin of non-parasitic ancestors? And is the trend towards small baramins that young Earth creationism model can easily explain, or are there a whole lot of gigantic baramins that make our lives a little bit more tricky? I did this research with funding through AIG and Andrew Snelling, and some students worked with me, some really good undergraduate students, Amber Rhodes and Maria Wintley, and then they presented their research at the Creation Biology Society conference. So I'm just going to kind of summarize Amber's research first and then Maria's. And we chose as our groups, these groups of marine animals. So we looked at 4 different phyla of marine animals, and we wanted to see how many parasites there are in these phyla, how many lineages there are, so how many times did a non-parasite adapt to a parasitic lifestyle, and then for each lineage, we wanted to see how speciose it is. And so is there any indication that parasitism is a recent event? Just looking at some of these flatworms that we looked at, there was quite a bit of evidence that parasitism might be relatively recent. First of all, a lot of these flatworm parasites, like this one, Micropharynx parasitica, this guy lives in the intestines of thorny skates, like you see here, and it eats diatoms. Its free-living forms also eat diatoms. So the feeding strategy is the same between parasitic and non-parasitic species. And so it's an endosymbiont that's classified as a parasite, but it's really not very different than the free-living forms. And that kind of provides some evidence that parasitism can be recent. Secondly, and really similarly, Avagina vivipara lives in the glorious sea potato here, a type of sea urchin, and it lives in the intestines, and it has no unique novel adaptations to parasitism. So the tapeworm, it has there's numerous novel adaptations to parasitism. The tapeworm looks designed to be in the human intestines, but this species, it doesn't have any unique novel morphologies or behaviors that obligate it to be parasitic, which is another indication that maybe it's a recent transition. And third, sometimes there are parasites that are facultative, which means they don't have to be parasitic, but if there's a nutrient source and you're hungry, you might as well use this. So Eurostoma are these little flatworms that typically live in mud and eat little bacteria, but if a mussel digs into the mud, then the Eurostoma will congregate around them because that's a much more dense, nutrient-rich food source, and they form these little cysts on the mussel's gills. And they can cause great damage, even death, to the mussels. But Eurostoma doesn't have to do this. They're perfectly fine living in the mud on their own. So facultative parasitism is another little bit of evidence that maybe parasitism is a recent transition. But I don't want to just look at some anecdotes. We want to systematically quantify the number of species, the number of lineages, and the number of species within those lineages, and then test for likelihood. So these are our four phyla. We got the jellyfish and corals in phylum Cnidaria. We have the comb jellies in Ctenophora, and then we have flatworms in both phylum Acylomorpha and Platyhelminthes. Collectively, this is over 40,000 species of animals. This is a really diverse group, from coral polyps to little tiny flatworms to gigantic 60-foot-long jellyfish and these really cool bioluminescent comb jellies. So it's a really diverse group. We kind of chose these arbitrarily. The students were interested in kind of marine biology, so we could have chosen anything, but this was just kind of a subset of all the parasites on Earth. And so for marine phyla, we want to know how many species, how many lineages, and how many species within those lineages. And first of all, we kind of need to set some parameters. So how big can a created kind be? If we're talking about likelihood, I said 100,000 is too big, and 1 is perfect. But that's a pretty big ratio, right? So another good part of science is to rely on other researchers as kind of established methodologies. And Jean Leitner, when she was working on vertebrate baramins for the Ark encounter, she estimated that the largest baramin at this point, kind of preliminarily, is the passerines, the songbirds, and it has about 1,500 species. So, this isn't definitive, right? This isn't proof of anything, but it's a nice model that I can then compare. So we kind of arbitrarily said, make a threshold of 1,500, and if most of our lineages are greater than 1,500, our conclusion would be that it's unlikely that the parasites evolved after the flood. If we look at all these lineages and most of them are less than 1,500, then it seems not unlikely that they are the result of a post-flood diversification event. Tracking with me so far? All right, so what we found, this is just a big list of taxa. You need to memorize all of these real fast. Just kidding, you don't have to memorize them. So these are all this is all the lineages of parasites. So this is a list of all the lineages that were used to be non-parasitic and are now parasitic. And if you recognize taxonomy at all, you notice most of these are italicized. Most of these has genus and species names. So most of the parasitic lineages are just a single species or a genus. There are a few families and a few orders, but these are largely genera and species. So we found 63 different lineages of parasites, which means within just these 4 phyla of animals, representing about 40,000 species, parasitism has emerged 63 independent times. Which is remarkable. That means something is drawing them towards parasitism. This is a good biological, and by good I mean functional biological lifestyle. You get protection, you get nutrients. So parasitism emerges really rapidly from non-parasitic ancestors. So among these, how many have more species than 1,500, and how many have fewer? Well, remarkably, out of those 63 lineages, only 3 lineages have more than 12. So 1,500 threshold ended up being way too much. There are only 3 lineages that have more species in them than just 12. The vast majority of these are obviously free-living at one point and have emerged into parasitism later. And this is remarkable. So usually, this was not what I was expecting at all. I was kind of expecting this to be a complicated, difficult thing to interpret, but what this shows is that the vast majority of lineages are perfectly compatible with a young Earth model. In fact, 95% of them are compatible. There you go. 95% of the parasite lineages studied are compatible with a recent transition into parasitism. And this is really remarkable evidence. So this is this quantifiable evidence. We started with a theological hypothesis and then asked a specific scientific question and tried to build a model and then test it for likelihood. And we found that it's perfectly compatible in majority of cases for parasitism to be a recent emergence from non-parasitic ancestors. And there's some anomalies, though, right? It was not 100%, it was 95%, which, by the way, is fantastic. For a biological model, 95% is exceeding all expectations. There's always anomalous stuff in biology and ecology. But some of these groups are quite big. The Neodermata, what are the Neodermata? Yeah, tapeworms. And blood flukes, the schistosomates that Dr. Engel was talking about. In Neodermata, depending on what you group in there, there's maybe 12 to 15,000 species in that one lineage. So how do we get 15,000 species from a single Brahmin? This is a problem. The Mixozoans, there could be as many as 30,000 potentially, depending on how you classify it. How do you get 30,000 descendants of parasites from a single non-parasitic ancestor? So what I like about model building is when it works, it's great. And even when it works, there's going to be some interesting questions that are still worth pursuing. So now we need to talk about, we need to investigate the tapeworms and the blood flukes. Is that a single baramin, or are there lots of independent baramins that have evolved? And so there's more baramins within the Neodermata than simply that one. So all kinds of interesting questions to ask after this. That was Amber's research. Maria's research really kind of asked the question, so from this, as we were doing this research, we basically had to look at every single parasite, and we had to look at every single parasite, read a whole lot of literature about its biology and its behavior and its relatives to see how they were free-living and how they were parasitic. And what we realized were that we started with this published authoritative list of parasites, and what we realized was that a lot of these that are supposedly parasitic, they don't really seem very parasitic to us. And if you only have 2 buckets, you have a parasite and a non-parasite, then you're kind of forced to put things either here or here, and life is way more complex. It's way more complicated than just parasitic or non-parasitic. So the PowerPoint's moving on without me, so I got to catch up. Parasitism is incredibly common. So here are some quotes by some famous parasitologists, Weinstein and Kuris. Easy there. Parasites may comprise nearly half of all animal life on Earth. And like Dr. Engel mentioned, probably every single species of animal life has its own unique little parasite. So, or endosymbiont, I should say. But here we're talking about parasites. They're defining parasitism. George Ray says that parasitism is the most common consumer strategy on the planet. It's more common than photosynthesis. It's more common than predation. The study of life is a study of parasitology. So if I'm a Trinitarian ecologist and I think that life, that nature reflects the character and the design of the creator, and life is a study of parasitology, and parasites are despicable, this is a deep problem for me. If life is parasitic, and the study life is a study parasites, that reflects really poorly on the character of God. Is God parasitic? Is God cruel and malevolent and selfish? No. So something's wrong here. Something's different here. Among our species, we found this to be true. We looked at those 4 marine phyla. There were 40,000 species, and 24,000 of them were parasites. More than half of all the species in these 4 phyla are parasitic, more than all the free-living taxa, more than all the predators. So these quotes about parasites are true, even in this subsection, this little subsample of all the animal life. So what do we do with this as creationists? And why are there so many? 63 lineages out of even just 4 phyla. Parasitism evolves again and again and again, from nice, happy little worms to horrible, terrifying worms with teeth. So the questions Maria and I were trying to answer was, why is parasitism so common? And what can the emergence of parasitism tell us about the character or purposes of their creator? Now we can move on. All right, so we started this research somewhat naively, as it turns out, with a simple definition of parasitism. Dr. Engel said that parasitism is an endosymbiosis where one species harms its host. This is how I define parasitism to my zoology students. This is kind of the classic definition of parasitism. You have a symbiotic relationship, and one harms and one benefits at the expense of harming the other. So we started with this definition. Parasitism is understood to be a close association of 2 organisms, symbiosis, in which one, the parasite, depends on the other for its continued existence. And then a second one we use from another authoritative source. At least part of the guest body is embedded in the host tissues, and the guest lives inside the host. So interesting, we have 2 definitions from 2 different authoritative parasitologists. One mentions harm, the other does not. Boero and Bouillon, who are really famous marine parasitologists, which was important for our marine parasitology research, they defined parasitism without reference to harm. You just have to have something embedded in the host tissue, and it has to be a close association, or the guest lives inside this host. And as you should know by now from Dr. Engel's lecture, you could have a lot of things living inside other things that, I skipped to the end. Not quite yet. Maybe I should put that down. And from Dr. Engel's lecture, you can have lots of animals living inside other animals without actually causing harm. So when exactly is a parasite not a parasite? First of all, it's definitely moving without me. I promise I wasn't touching you. You got to behave. So first of all, some of these species are only facultatively parasitic. So there's a really difference between an obligate parasite like a tapeworm and a facultative parasite like Urostoma cyprini, which when it's convenient and accessible, it's happy to chew on tissue and invade resources whenever possible. Secondly, it's really difficult to quantify the fitness cost to the host. So technically, according to Weinstein and Kuris' definition of parasitism, and just the common, what we think of as parasites, you're supposed to harm your host in some way. I'm about to harm the PowerPoint in some way. But it's really difficult to quantify. So if you have a Scarus lumbricoides in your intestine, you're a gigantic creature, and a Scarus lumbricoides, is 6 inches, which is uncomfortably large for an endosymbiont. But you're so much larger, you don't really notice it and you don't really feel it. So how do we quantify the effect of one organism on another? This is a really difficult scientific question to ask, is to actually measure and quantify fitness costs. If you have parasites, are you less likely to find resources? Are you less likely to find mates? Are your offspring less healthy? So it's actually very difficult to connect harm with parasitism in any robust sense. Third, sometimes, I'm going to get through this slide, I promise you. Third, sometimes in the literature, these marine parasites are really rare. So when we look up the life cycle of some really rare jellyfish, we would realize that it's been discovered once, it's been described once, and we only have one little jellyfish in a jar somewhere in the National Museum of History. And we don't know really anything about its behavior or its biology or its life cycle, but the jellyfish was found on the back of a sea turtle, and the original describer calls it parasitic. But there has been no robust definition of fitness costs, no observation of harm on its host. It's just described as a parasite because you're a parasitologist, and so you naturally see things as parasitic if you see symbioses. And I think this is really interesting because one's worldview can color your science in important ways. If you're looking for parasitism and you see symbioses, you see parasitism. If you're looking for mutualism and you see symbioses, you see mutualism. Don't look. No spoilers. So all of the fourth, actually there's like 5 or 6 other things. But fourth, some of these parasites are only parasitic as larvae. So like the parasitoid insects, for example, they're parasitic as larvae, and then the adults are free-living pollinators, happy and peaceful and pure. And so is this a parasite or is this a free-living form? If you only have 2 buckets, they belong to both, and they belong to neither. So life is more complicated than that when you have multiple life stages of the same creature, and there's parasitic only in one life stage of that. You can also have parasitism, like Dr. Engel was talking about, where 1 Ascaris is fine, 10,000 kills you. And so what's regulating the amount of Ascaris in your body? What's regulating the amount of parasite eggs you get on the counter and then you ingest? How is that being controlled? It seems that there is a lot of variability in infection and the relationship between the parasite and host that really complicates the definition of parasite. So we came up with a strict definition of parasite just to investigate how many of these parasites are extremely parasitic and how many of them, if we really took a really kind of very radical definition of parasite, so that just the absolute proof. So you have to have parasites that are obligately inflict measurable fitness costs on their hosts under normal circumstances and at all life stages. So this is kind of a ridiculously strict definition of parasite. I wouldn't recommend using this as a new definition of parasite, but we were just interested in how much this changes our lineage count. Does this reduce, how we know it's going to reduce from 63 to something, but how much? So when we looked at the parasitic lineages, there are 63 we established, initially described under the broad definition. But when we applied that strict definition, what we found was that there were only 10. So only 10 parasitic lineages fit that very strict definition. So when you go back to all these parasitologists talking about how life is a study of parasitology and how parasitism is the most common consumer strategy on the planet, that's not necessarily true. It all depends on how you define parasitism. And I'm certainly not suggesting that we use this strict definition. Certainly some of these that were eliminated are really despicable creatures. I really want to emphasize 2 things. First is that definitions matter. And so if you make a claim about the despicable or the grotesque or evil or good in nature, you need to really have a good, robust definition that we can then talk about. And secondly, the reason these are difficult to define is that nature is really dynamic, which Dr. Engel said too. Nature is really dynamic and it changes, and organisms don't obey the rules that you would like them to do. So they wander where they're not supposed to be, they accumulate where they're not supposed to be, they eat things they're not supposed to eat, and that's just life. It's dynamic, and it makes it interesting and wonderful. So what does, one thing I mentioned, look at here, most of the loss of, you gotta look really quickly because it's gonna go. Most of the loss you see here from Nigeria, 42, it reduces it to 4. These are mostly sedentary sea anemones that were classified as parasitic, and then under the strict definition, they lose that definition of parasitism. So we were kind of interested in why. Are there a certain reason why a sessile filter feeder, a sedentary animal that just waves its tentacles in the water, catching organic particles, is there a reason why such a creature is more predisposed to parasitism than another? You guys saw that, right? I'm not touching it. It's moving on its own. And I think there is. So if you imagine diffusion, so diffusion is just a natural process where molecules are basically moving at random, but because they move at random, they tend to go from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration. So if there is high concentration here, they will go here. And so if God created a world of mutualism, where you have deeply harmonious, good relationships, that's high concentration. What is going to naturally happen if that sustaining power that prevents parasitism is maybe removed at the fall? Then organisms just kind of diffuse away from mutualism into parasitism. So a really specific example, you gotta stop. Here is the sea anemones on the back of a crab. So this is a commensal relationship, and you can imagine a little sea anemone, which is a sedentary polyp. It just has a little oral disc that it sits on the ground with, and then tentacles that it collects food with. It doesn't care where it lives. It can land on a rock or a log or the sand or a sea turtle. As long as there's nutrients around, it survives and is fine. Well, given enough time, some of these sea anemones are going to land on the back of a crab, and that crab's a messy eater. Every time that crab eats food, there's this whole cloud of nutrients in the ocean around it. And so this is good for the sea anemone. So this becomes, over time, an epizoic commensal creature, a species that seeks out crabs to live on because this is a good food source. And over even more time, though, you kind of realize, so the tentacles and the petal disc that attaches the glue to them, that glues them to the substrate, they have glands and they have sensory organs, and it doesn't take that much imagination to imagine that all of a sudden you realize you're standing on this wonderful resource of food. So why am I spending all my time with these fancy tentacles trying to catch little things out of the ocean when I can just turn those tentacles down and feed right where I am? And so it doesn't take too much imagination to see this transition from free living to epizoic to parasitic. And this is what we see. And then furthermore, that parasitism can become obligative. So this is actually a crustacean parasite called Saculina that invades a crab's system and actually castrates it and then takes over control of its whole body and manipulates it that way. This is what the organism looks like. It looks like a kidney bean with spaghetti. There's no eyes, there's no arms, there's no brain, it's a completely degenerative parasite. It must live in the crab host. It cannot function on its own. And so you can see this transition from a free living form with all these wonderful morphologies and adaptations of behaviors. It just diffuses into parasitism because that's where it has to go. If things start good, there's only one direction they can go, right? And interestingly, now, if they're bad, they can become good, or they can become worse. And I think that's interesting. So what does this mean? What does this trend, this randomness in nature, what does that reveal about the character of God? Because this is what's interesting to me. When I look at parasitism, can I pull something of genuine eternal importance from this? Richard Dawkins, you may have heard of him. He looks at the same evidence I do, this randomness in nature, and he says that the universe that we observe has precisely the properties we would expect if there was no God. If there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference. So he looks at randomness in nature and he sees indifference. And honestly, so what changed between Kuchenmeister and me? Why were all the parasitologists, Vallisneri and Kuchenmeister and everybody else, why were all these natural theologians arguing for design in nature as part of their science? And why is it so different now for us? The answer is randomness in nature. So Kuchenmeister and his allies, they considered God to be purposeful, no accidents, no randomness in nature. And when Darwin and just the evidence in nature shows that there is waste in nature, there is chance, happenstance, there is apparent randomness in nature, the natural theologians didn't have a good response. And so they abandoned they abandoned this philosophy of no design in nature and natural theology as well, and they just gave it up to the secular atheists. And I think this is a mistake. So I think we have an opportunity to find something deeper. So superficially, God is God of harmony and love, and that's awesome, purposeful, design. Those arguments make sense to me. But in reality, when you look at nature, it's dynamic. Why is it dynamic? Why does it diffuse away from good? Why is there randomness? Why do tapeworms have to lay 300 million eggs until one gets infected? This bothered a lot of the early parasitologists. They thought there's no way those can really be tapeworm eggs because every egg has to find its right host. This is false. So what do we do with this? So in my opinion here, I think this can reveal something really amazing about God. And something that we know from Christian doctrine is found in the character of the Trinity, not just love, not just harmony, but also a freedom that is inherent in nature. So first of all, symbioses are ubiquitous. They're everywhere. The interconnectedness of ecosystems, this reflects wonderfully the relational aspect of God. God is relationship, he's Trinity, and ecosystems are relationship. And I think this is really beautiful. Second, symbioses are dynamic, which is really interesting. So St. Augustine argued that because God is immutable, by necessity, anything that he makes has to be mutable. God can't make an immutable creation. Only God is immutable. And so mutability means change. So St. Augustine taught that nature has to be changed, that nature is good because a good God created it, but that good can be augmented and it can be diminished. And I think this is a really important theological point because I think it reveals that God values harmony and love, and God values freedom. Why would God value freedom? Because he wants us to freely love him, and that because love has to be free. God is perfectly free, and he's perfectly love. And we are imperfectly free, and we imperfectly love, but we still reflect those attributes of God. And God wants in nature to reflect his attributes, so nature imperfectly reflects love and imperfectly reflects freedom. But this is why we see that diffusion so readily from non-parasitic ancestors to parasitism. It's not because we have a pitiless, indifferent creator. It's because we have a creator who values freedom so that he can get creatures who love him and join forever in relationship with him. So, 3 conclusions. I think faith can and should inspire your specific scientific investigations. And I think especially if you're a younger creationist, where a lot of the scientific evidence is against you, you need to be willing to do difficult scientific work. And you need to think creatively and imaginatively about how to answer some of these difficult questions. Vallisneri came up with this idea 300 years ago that we're still relying on today. So be creative and imaginative about thinking about difficult solutions. Second, this world is good, and the despicable might not be as common as we think. Half of life is not parasitic. Endosymbiosis is ubiquitous. Parasitism is not. And yet, parasitism still exists. The despicable does exist, and I think that reveals that this world is broken. It doesn't seem to be the world that God wants. Doesn't seem to be the world that God designed, and so we should do eradication and redemption whenever possible. And then third, I think nature reveals a God who values love, harmony, and freedom. Thank you.